opportunity to introduce to you today our keynote speaker, Nina Schwartz. Now, I first heard of Nina a few years ago when a group of us were working to restart the Chicago chapter of the Association of Women in Science. We had enthusiasm and a fresh start. We were looking for inspiration. Luckily, we did not have to search far to find one of the founders of AWIS in our midst, Nina. I will let Nina tell her own story of that beginning. But one thing that stood out is that Nina's story is a call to action. Where are we? What is the challenge to tackle? And what can we do about it? This strength and call to action has been part of what our AWIS chapter is a large part of who Nina is, and is reflected in the hundreds of individuals that have been through her labs and mentored by her. In 2002, Nina received the AAAS Mentor Award for Lifetime Achievement. The title, I believe, speaks for itself. In her recently published autobiography, A Lab of My Own, Nina has this to say about mentoring, and I quote, "I have had a hard time grasping that I am being praised and rewarded for mentoring, which seems to me to be a critical element of what being a researcher and a teacher is about." Nina asked me not to hype her up. She said that she would not appear in a superhero cape. No problem. Nina is not hype. She is deed. She is inspiration. She is. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Nina Schwartz.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry I didn't wear that cape. Really a Spider Woman or something. I wanted to remind you of the quote from Virginia Woolf's The Room of One's Own. "But you may say we asked you to speak about women in fiction. What has that got to do with a room of one's own? All I could do was offer you an opinion upon one minor point. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction." And I think if you substitute for write fiction, do science, that you have the Virginia quote. I've been asked to talk about three things. Some of the obstructions that I faced in the bad old days, why women scientists formed AWIS, and my thoughts on mentoring. In 1949, I was in graduate school here at Northwestern, and just down the way in the Ward building. And I was getting on the elevator. This was I know this is unbelievable to you, but this is before computers. I was carrying a 9-inch round slide rule on which I calculated all my data. And one of the male physicians got on the elevator with me and said, "What's a little girl like you doing with that great big slide rule?" Well, I thought for years of things what I could have said to him, but I didn't. I smiled. 4 years later, I got my first job. My first job was in the Department of Physiology at the University of Illinois College of Medicine. And I was an instructor, which is a non-tenure track position. The reason I got the job, as the chairman said, there was one woman in the department who had gotten pregnant, and he felt that it was inappropriate for a pregnant woman to lecture to medical students. So I became an instructor. The first day on the job, we had a department meeting, and he asked me if I would pour the tea. I was, again, the only woman in the room. I said yes, I smiled sweetly, and I said, perhaps somebody else can do it next time. Well, I was worried about being an instructor, a non-tenure position, and I talked to the chairman. I had gotten my first R01. I had a couple of graduate students already working in my lab, and he said that he would do it in time. A year later, Unfortunately, one of the faculty members, who was our cardiovascular physiologist, died in an accident. And my chairman invited me into his office and asked me if I would begin to teach the cardiovascular physiology. I'm an endocrinologist, and I knew it was going to be a lot of work. So I said I'd be happy to if I became an assistant professor. I got my assistant professorship, so I became somebody in the tenure track position. Well, this is what life was like back then. In that same year, Anita Payne, who was a scientist working at that time in San Francisco, won an award from the Cancer Society, and the headlines in the San Francisco newspaper read, "Two Bay housewives win the cancer award." And in the article, Anita was described as a glamorous housewife. Let me tell you, Anita later became president of the Society for the Study of Reproduction. She died 2 years ago, and this year the SSR meeting is going to honor her in a full day of research papers. This is that housewife back in the 70s. In 1971, 27 women met at a Federation for American Societies of Experimental Biology at a wine and cheese reception and formed AWIS. Let me tell you something about that day. For several years before 1971, the lab glassware firm Condis had sponsored a wine and cheese evening for women at the annual meeting. At the end of the evening in 1971, the wine was all out and they closed the booth. And there were 27 of us standing there. We had been drinking for a couple of hours. And we just didn't want the evening to end. So we went to someone's room, and the 27 of us squeezed in there between the dresser and the bed and formed the Association for Women in Science, and that's the way it began. Judy Poole, who was a hematologist at Stanford, and I agreed to be the co-presidents. And we established a goal at that time, to seek equality for women in the professions. During the 1970s, women in many professions began to form their own organizations. And there were really four purposes to these. One was that women wanted to get equal opportunities and rights in reaching their professional goals, which we're still talking about today. We wanted to promote, recognize, and act on women's perspectives in the professional fields. Now that presupposes that there are women's perspectives. And this came up sort of in a slanting way in one of the panels. We can talk about that later, because I think there are some perspectives and we were anxious to be able to act on them. Importantly, these organizations were expected to train women in the administrative and political aspects of their professions. Most of us didn't have a chance to do any of this, and we didn't know how to do it. And so these women's organizations formed an important part of our repertoire. And finally, frankly, this was during the beginning of the major feminist movement, we wanted to promote consciousness raising. And our underlying strategy was to form a club of our own and then use that to get into the big boys club. And that was an unstated purpose. Well, we were looking for something to do. Here we were with a new organization. What we did was look at the membership and study sections at NIH. In the basic study sections, only 2% of the reviewers were women. Not a single one of us in AWIS had ever been on a study section. What really got us going was that we asked for the breast cancer panels, and of several hundred members, only 3 were women, and that did it. So we went to a lawyer here in Chicago who suggested that we take out an injunction against NIH to keep them from putting new scientists on study sections until they began to add women. So the first major venture of AWIS was to sue NIH. And what we did was we went ahead and developed a list of women obviously capable of serving in this capacity. So, having taken out the injunction, several of us from AWIS, the Biophysics Society, the Women's Equity Action League, the National Organization for Women, and the American Women's Medical Association went to Washington and had an appointment with Robert Marston, who was then head of the National Institutes of Health. With Marston was a representative from Elliot Richardson, who at that time was secretary of HEW. We pointed out that there were very few women on the study sections. We suggested that that new appointments to the study sections be frozen until women had the opportunity to suggest names for the open positions. NIH and HEW agreed to do that and gave us a list of 413 vacancies. Incidentally, my brother at the time was the associate director of NIH. And before going to NIH, I called him on the phone and warned him about it. And all he did was laugh, said he wasn't surprised, that he would tell Marston that I was his sister. So by January of that year, we had developed a list of over 1,000 women who were capable of filling the vacancies. And this list was turned over as part of a documentation accompanying a class action suit against HEW and NIH. The AWIS officer signed this as a plaintiff. Other plaintiffs were Association of Women in Psychology, the Caucus of Women's Biophysicists, Sociologists for Women in Society. See, all of these had been formed within the last couple of years. The Association for Women in Mathematics, National Organization of Women, and Women's Equity Leagues. Our suit was eventually dropped because many of the women on our list began to be made members of study sections. To me, this is an example. I don't know whether you can read the t-shirt. Well-behaved women make history when they do the unexpected, when they create and preserve records, and when later generations care. This is from a book by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who's a professor of history at Harvard, and I recommend that book to anybody who wants to look at the marvelous historical view of this kind of thing, not about science, but about other things. Well, in 1974, I was recruited to Northwestern, and the evening that I first appeared on campus, there was a party, and 2 of the female graduate students in the department came up to me and asked me, do they laugh when you give a paper at a meeting? I said, only when I make a joke. But that really upset me. These women had not met a single senior research woman in their 2 years in the science departments here at Northwestern. I'd like to switch from those bad old days, because that's what life was like, and talk a little bit about some points that have actually been covered by our panel discussions. Virginia Valiant has written a book called Why So Slow, which I think is a marvelous treatise. And she says, she feels that 2 things hold up the glass ceiling for women. Gender schema, a set of implicit or non-conscious hypotheses about sex differences, which we've already heard something about in our panel. These hypotheses play a central role in shaping the professional lives of both men and women. They affect our expectations, our evaluations, and our performance. She then goes on to talk about the accumulation of advantage. Like interest on capital, advantage accrues. The more you start with, at the same interest level, the higher you go. Like interest on debt, disadvantages also accrue. If you start low, even if you're getting the same percentage raise every year that other people are getting, you stay low. And this is, I think, a very important thing to remember. We've already heard about this. Let me just repeat it briefly. For the same behaviors, men are frequently called collaborative, where women are identified as needy. Men may be called judicious, but women are called timid. Men can be identified as flexible, but women flighty. The band of acceptable behavior is narrower for women than it is for men, and I think that's still true. It certainly was true back in the bad old days, and I think it's still true. One thing that one of the panels hinted at was the question of self-identity. This is recently in, this is in Nature. There was an article called Unmasking the Imposter, Nature 2010. And they talk about the imposter phenomenon, the difficulty that one has in internalizing one's own competence and success. And I think all of us have felt this at one time or another, and probably it's just a normal thing. The question is, do women have this more than men? And I don't know, my guess is that they do, but I don't really know. I don't know if there are any studies on this. Well, nothing's changed in a way. We all know that in 2004, Larry Summers, then president of Harvard, now important in our government in Washington, suggested that innate gender differences between the sexes might explain the few women in science and math. And we've already heard a discussion of that and how women tend to believe what they're told, how women start out, or girls start out equal in math to boys, and then that shifts as they grow up. So sometimes I think nothing ever changes. I've been asked by the leaders of this symposium to talk a little bit about mentoring. Who is a mentor? A person who coaches, advises, supports, and initiates a protege into the adult professional world by teaching her the tricks of the trade. And this is from the booklet published by the National Association for Women in Science. Well, for people in training, a mentor should help the mentee define research and career goals. I think this is very important to do that, to help somebody understand what their possibilities are and maybe help them make the decision about it. I think trainees need to be nurtured and they need to be helped by guiding them. But I think it's very important not to impose your own sense of what is appropriate to do and what is not. Do not stifle independent thought, either in their research or their career goals. I think it's very important for women in academia, like myself, many others in this room, not to expect that all of your trainees will enter the academic world or be happy with it. And I think this is a very important thing that we need to think about. You need to demand the best you can be, but permit mistakes. there are people who actually yell at students who make a mistake in the lab, in front of the whole lab. And unfortunately, there are some people at Northwestern that I've heard do this. This is a terrible thing to do, and it should never be done, man or woman. Teach trainees to cooperate with others. In my own opinion, everybody in the lab is responsible for data, for cleaning up and for the animals. And there shouldn't be a hierarchy of who does what. Everybody is responsible for the data that comes out of a laboratory and the experiments that go into it. I always felt that it was important to train students to present their research in a public setting. And I think that's particularly important for women. My own students always had to have a one sentence. If somebody said, "What are you doing?" One sentence, "This is what I'm doing." Don't tell anybody more than they want to hear. Then I wanted them to have a 2-minute description in case somebody was not running out of the room, and a 5-minute description ready. Let me tell you the best thing that anybody ever told me about mentoring. One of my students had given a paper at the Endocrine Society meeting, and someone came up to me at the end of the hour and said they can always tell a Schwartz student because the women stand up, look straight, talk loudly, and are very positive about what they're doing. And I think for women, it's particularly important for them to be trained to give papers like that. Trainees need to be introduced to scientists in their field, and you need to show them scientific ethics. I know we've had a course in our training programs here on ethics. No courses will do anything for a student who sees their chief of the laboratory cheating in something. So if you want students to have ethics, you need to show them how to do it. This is a cartoon of Dilbert's. I don't know whether you can read it. I'll read it for you. Let's go around the table and give an update on each of our projects. This is the boss. One of the people. My project is a pathetic series of poorly planned, near random acts of my life as a tragedy of emotional desperation. We've all felt like that, I know. Boss, it's more or less customary to say that things are going fine. I think I need a hug. And I think that one of the important things to do is that everybody needs a hug every once in a while, some positive reinforcement. I don't know whether you can see, being retired, I spent a couple of weeks in Tanzania 2 years ago, and was particularly struck as we were driving in a safari truck along the road to see this ape with a small ape on its back. And I immediately had the feeling that that's part of what mentoring is like with students, that at least for part of the trip, that they're on your back. These are two great nieces of mine, great nieces. That is, their mother is my niece, and on the left is Olivia, and on the right is Zoe. Olivia is 12, Zoe's 15, and I want to make sure that both of these people, they don't know what they want to do yet, but I'd like to make sure that if they want to become physicians or scientists, that they can do it. And I think this is one of the goals that we need to have. All right, I've said something about mentoring students. For colleagues, a mentor should make sure that women are recommended for talks, committees, and positions. And I think that's very, very important, that we need to recommend each other. It always appalls me that chairmen of department frequently don't know how a CV ought to look. So I think it's important for you to critique CVs for junior people to make sure that they're appropriate and clear. and open doors for others once you have been through. You don't need or want to be a queen bee. So I think it's very important to support each other. Well, why mentor? It's work, it's a nuisance sometimes, that isn't always fun. The rewards of mentoring are so great that it's surprising that more people are not involved with it. For the mentor, the achievements of the person encouraged are akin to the victories of one's own child. Mentoring is a gift that gives. Thank you very much.
Okay, now we have time for questions. Okay. We've got our first question down here.
Okay, I don't hear very well, so speak up.
I'm Pushpa Bhatt. I'm a scientist from Fermilab. Just have a comment about your 1953 Dr. Schwartz, would you pour some tea? Pour the tea. If men do that, I mean, even 50 years, more than 50 years later, I mean, you confront this sort of attitude. If men do that, of course, they're gentlemen. I mean, you know, a few years ago, when I had lunches with, you know, one of my colleagues, male colleagues, you know, I was deputy head of an important technical project, and sometimes if we had to go to a meeting immediately after the lunch, if we had to rush, you know, one of us would take the trays, lunch trays, and put it away. So once when I was taking the tray, one of my colleagues actually commented, "Oh, good housekeeping." You know, so that's the kind of comments that even now you hear. So, and one has to be very careful how you respond to it. Recently, in fact, again, you know, a bunch of us were sitting at the table, and one of my colleagues was going to a meeting, so I encouraged him to leave the you know, cup in my tray. And then another colleague said, "Oh, I have to go. Can I leave that here?" So, you know, they sometimes, if you are not, as you said, make comments like you did, next time somebody else can do it, you could become you know, an easy victim of such attitudes.
Yeah. I guess the main point is just advice of how do you deflect the comments of pouring the tea or things of that sort. So.
What was the comment?
Just that still, even though it's no longer 1953, sometimes there's still the implication that we will pour the tea or that the woman in the group will clear the table or things of that sort.
Walk out. I don't know what else to say.
Dr. Schwartz, I really appreciated your guiding us through some of the historical landmarks and especially the role of professional associations for women. This is our first conference here in Chicago. It's really a cross-sector of many women doing many things. What do you see ought to be the role currently, given the current state of women in science, mentoring? Do you have some thoughts about what associations ought to be thinking about and considering as their role, agenda points, given your historical perspective and in your role as a mentor?
Are you referring to AWIS itself, the local AWIS?
It could be local AWIS, but it could also be, as you mentioned, there are many ways in which women science associations have convening points for women. Mm-hmm. And what are some of the topics or agenda points you think folks like us should be considering?
Well, I've been to a couple of the local AWIS meetings, and I think just having dinner with some of the younger people found myself able to answer some questions. I think that there ought to be definite programs. The AWIS does have definite programs here. I know that they've met a couple of times at Northwestern. I think there are a lot of things that have been said in the panels. The business about asking for salary increases, I think this is something that needs to be talked about. And what do you do if somebody asks you to clear the table? You know, how do you deflect that without seeming aggressive? You know, whatever that means to people. And I think it does people good just to get together and talk. I mean, I think it's important not to just bitch all the time. And let me tell you something here that I'm reminded of. When I first became chair of biology, I don't think there was another female chair in the College of Arts and Sciences. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think that there was. And the young women who were either graduate students or postdocs in the biology department asked me if I would meet with them once a month to talk about problems. And, you know, as a new chair, I said, well, you know, I have equal obligations to the men and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, do you mind meeting with us for a while? What I found was that it was just as important to me as it was to them. Because I found myself with a department that was very cantankerous and was angry because I was from a medical school and expected that I was going to impose my research on, you know, blah, blah, blah. And it was as important for me as it was for them. One of the things that occurred as a result of that is not a single woman in that group left graduate school, in contrast to a number of other women around. One of them, in fact, is the past president of AWIS, Joan Hoover, who was a graduate student in the department at the time. But that was very, very striking. People needed that, and I think that made a difference. That was a very simple thing to do. You just have tea in the afternoon and bitch.
I have a very simple question. So what did you do when your student or fellows made a mistake?
How do you handle when your students or fellows make mistakes?
Or they have a disagreement with you?
We've just had a scientific discussion, as a matter of fact, at lunch, so it's a legitimate question. Well, it depends on how expensive the disagreement is. I mean, if they want to do I don't have a lab anymore, but if they want to do an experiment that's going to be terribly expensive and I don't think it's going to work, they really have to work very hard to get me to give them permission to do it. For a few bucks, it doesn't matter whether, you know, let them try it. And, you know, occasionally I was wrong. You know, it doesn't happen very frequently, obviously. But in my entire career, there was only one time when I had a student cheating on data. And that's a scary thing, as you know. And the way I found out about it, she was supposed to have been in the animal room at least once a day to make an observation. And my other graduate students never found her in the lab, in the animal room when they came in. So they actually set up, without saying anything to me, a 24-hour vigil to see if she came in. And when she didn't, they came and said something to me. Now, you know, is that tattletelling? No. I mean, the lab is important. It's very important. I talked to the student, and indeed, she had not been going in. She'd been making up the data. And in fact, it turned out that she had a drinking problem, which, you know, I should have picked up. But there's only one thing to do under those circumstances. You cannot have somebody like that in the lab. You know, I tried to get her some help, but you cannot be in the lab. So that's the only, as far as I know, that's the only time that happened, that particular thing happened.
Hi, I'm Tiffany from Argonne National Lab. Mentors have been very important to me in the early stage of my career. Did you have mentors in the early stage of your career?
The question is, did you have mentors for you when you were early in your career?
Thank you for asking that. That's excellent. First of all, I went to a women's college, which is now both men and women. But that, I think, was very important. In fact, there were data a number of years ago showing that there were more women getting PhDs who had gone to women's colleges than in mixed colleges. My advisor here was a male, Alan Lane, and he couldn't have been more wonderful. And I was lucky enough to go to the Jackson lab for 2 summers and work with a developmental biologist, another male, so that both of them were just marvelous and gave me a lot of confidence. They let me argue with them, and sometimes I won and sometimes they won. So I had male mentors who were terrific. It can be done. I never got put down by them, let me tell you that.
Jen?
Well, first of all, I feel really proud to be a woman starting in the field of science, and I'm a particle physics grad student at University of Chicago. And I really admire you and for founding the Association for Women in Science. However, we know that, like, in science, there are very few women, but there are also other professions when women take the dominance. However, we don't see associations for men in nursing or stuff like that. And on the other hand, we don't see association for like blondes in science or redheads in science because we know that hair colors do not matter. And so while we are trying to build an identity for women in science, is there the possibility that in the future we would be able to be strong enough and be confident enough that we do not need to identify ourselves as female scientists anymore, but just as scientists? I really like that when you started with quoting Virginia Woolf, because like she is also my favorite writer. And she said that women have been acting like magnifying mirrors for so many years in history, in which the image of men are magnified and stretched. And so, is it because we have been humbled for too many years in history that we need to come together for this single identity? Or is there a chance that we could go beyond the gender names themselves for actual equality?
Is the issue that we should be doing something for men, or that we should just...
Well, also the thought of over time, since we've all come together to identify as women and women in science, will there be a point where that's no longer necessary?
Forgive me for having to ask, but I do have a hearing problem, and somehow or other, we have microphones on and you don't. There's a major book on feminism, which I quote in my autobiography, which points out that the purpose of feminism is not to turn science or anything else into a women's issue. That science is too important. It has to be done by everybody. It has to be felt by everybody. And I don't think women want to be 90% of the scientists. I don't think that's the issue. I think that women, or at least let me say, that I feel that women do have a special way of looking at some issues in science, as in the breast cancer panel example, which I gave you. And I think these issues need to be looked at for the sake of the country. I mean, as I look politically at us, I worry about things in terms of the environment and a number of other things. We can't afford to only have 50% of our population women, scientists, which is what it's been. We need everybody who can do it. I think the issue will go away eventually. I'd like to think that it will go away eventually. There'll be some other issue, undoubtedly, but yeah, I don't think there's anything special. I think that the country suffers if women aren't permitted to do what they can do.
Hi, Dr. Schwartz. I just want to say thanks for talking with us today. I'm a medical student here, so I've heard so much about you. And, I just wanted to say, throughout my medical career, I'm a 4th year now, probably 5 out of 5, 6 out of 6 of my recommendations for residency were from males. And my question is, why is it so difficult at times for women to mentor other women in some situations? Of course, you're an example of the total opposite of this, but I think this is something that I've experienced and I know other people have experienced, and I was wondering if you have any tips for women who are developing their careers to mentor other women.
Sorry about this.
So the main issue here is that, for example, in the medical profession, sometimes it's easier to find male mentors than women mentors. So what is the advice, I think, that you would give to women?
You mean because there are fewer women, or because women don't want to mentor?
Maybe, I think both.
Both?
Women not feeling comfortable mentoring or not
putting
themselves out there.
Certainly if somebody feels uncomfortable mentoring, you shouldn't ask them to mentor you. I mean, I think that, my principal mentors have been males. I don't think there's any issue about it. I think that women are sometimes afraid of being identified as somebody who mentors other women somehow or other, that they'll have a problem with that, or that they're not real physicians or not real scientists if that's what they're doing. And if that's the way they feel about it, I'm not sure the advice that you'll get from them is going to be good. I think it's unfortunate that people, and also, people are busy. They're either busy on their research, or their teaching, or their kids, or something else. So,
okay, I think we have time for a couple more.
Again, thank you for coming and speaking to us. I'm Diane Hickey-Davis. I have one question. Most of us have been on some advisory committee to, have a meeting, and we get together and we plan to have a wine and cheese social. You got together and you decided to sue the NIH. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what went through your mind, and what, there must have been implications that you were considering what happens if I do this and am associated.
When your wine and cheese social ended up with the suing of the NIH. So just if you could speak a little bit more about the decision process to take such a bold step.
There was no alternative, we thought. I mean, we really, the R01 grant for the academic scientists is the entry part. And it seemed obvious to us that that's where we needed to go. Now, has it mattered that women are now on committees? I finally did get on the study section. I was on the endocrinology study section for a number of years. And I ask myself every once in a while, does it matter that there are 3 women in this room of 20 men? The committee was 20, there were 3 of us who were women. Are we really making a difference for women? One day, all 3 of us happened to be in the ladies' room at the same time, And we discovered that all 3 of us, without having consulted with each other, were imperceptibly or perceptibly raising the scores for some of the women over the men. And the reason we were doing that was that the men, because of some of the things that got said in the study section. For example, we would be discussing a woman's grant, and somebody would say casually, I wonder whose ideas these are. Well, I mean, I assume it's the PI's ideas, okay? Or if there were a male whose grant was being looked at, boy, he really knows how to go for the jugular, okay? So there was this subtle interaction that we were seeing as we thought about it between the way in which people were discussing the women's grants and the men's grants. So we tried to make up for it. Okay. And if you only have 3 out of 20, you can't do a lot. But if you've got 10 out of 20, you can do a whole lot.
Okay, we've got one more question.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, and being so young, the future seems to have so many options and so many choices, and I often find myself not knowing which way to go and who to go to for answers, and so having a mentor seems like a really great sort of opportunity that's out there, but I know personally I've never known that there's any sort of mentorship programs out there. No one's actually come to me and said, do you want a mentor? So being so young, how do you begin the process of looking for a mentor? How do you find a mentor? Like, how does that happen?
How do you find a mentor early in your career as an undergraduate?
I think it's very important to do science as an undergraduate. I think since I went to a small college, there weren't science projects that I could get into, which is why I wound up at Jackson Lab for 2 summers. Great experience. I think that as you apply to a lab, spend some time in the lab. I think just an hour sitting around a lab and watching the interaction between people can teach you a lot about the relationship between the technicians and the postdocs or the graduate students or the mentor. So I think a little anthropological study in anticipation in a lab is a very good way of, does it feel comfortable? Does it feel so competitive that you think you're going to get a headache every time you walk in? So that would be my advice. Spend some time.
Okay, so that's all the time that we have for questions. Let's thank Nina Schwartz once again.